a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, beach readers, porch swing readers, and boat readers. I'm Grant Faulkner, and I'm here with my co-host, Brooke Warner. And Brooke, one thing I love about summer is that it's a season celebrated for reading, and it's maybe the only season truly celebrated for reading in the sense that libraries have summer reading programs and adults slow down a bit to relax and read on vacation. There's a whole term for it, beach reads. So each of us have expressed, challenges with our reading, though, which is so strange in our profession. And we've each, at different times, I think, expressed a longing to read with the sort of deep immersion that we once did. So I'm curious if this summer has been a summer of reading for you at all.
Well, I guess if you're asking if it's been a summer of pleasure reading or work reading, because if it's the former, no. If it's the latter, yes. This summer, I probably read 3 novels and 5 memoirs by authors or writers that I work with. Funny enough, though, I listened to Lidia's book, The Chronology of Water. It actually occurred to me when we had her on for the second time on this podcast that I had read a few of her other books, but not Chronology of Water, which is the one she's actually most famous for. I did this in one single day audiobook on a car ride from Palm Springs to Berkeley in June. And I will report back that it should be required reading for memoirists, which I knew, but now I can corroborate. So there's that. How about you, Grant? Any particular summer reading you want to share?
Well, I wish I was driving from Berkeley to Palm Springs and back and listening to some books, because that sounds really pleasant. I think I'm reading a little bit more than usual, but life just, isn't really seasonal for me because I basically work all the time, and my vacations aren't vacations because they're usually focused on caring for my mom. So I still long for a period of pure reading. And like you, I mainly do work reading, which just is somehow different, even when they're great books. And that said, I'm constantly trying to systematize my reading by blocking out a regular time to read each day, right after I return from my dog walk. Also, I do plan to listen to more books. I've been inspired by you and all of our listeners who say they listen to this podcast while they're walking the dog or doing laundry. And June Gervais, I'm looking at you and your laundry pile right now. So hang in there. If my only pleasure reading could match the amount of laundry in my house, I would be good. June told me that she folds laundry while she listens to us. So yeah. So anyway, one reason reading is on my mind, Brooke, is because I'm more than a little obsessed with a theme that came up with several guests this year, namely reclaiming your story. And one part of reclaiming your story is to retell your story and to retell it your way. And we are our stories, essentially. But unfortunately, we are also the stories that are told about us. We internalize those and they shape us. And it's hard to wrestle with those stories that are, told about us when they're wrong, especially in the case of Amanda Knox, because she was literally ensnared by a thicket of false stories that accused her of just a horrible, heinous murder. And that was told by the media around the world. And she was even convicted of this crime and spent 4 years in prison. And I know that you have thoughts about reclaiming our stories and the role of narrative in shaping our lives, Brooks. So what are your thoughts about the general theme of reclaiming?
Yeah, I guess I think that reclaiming is part of what memoir is, really. I'm not sure that you would write a memoir in the first place if there wasn't some part of your life that you wanted to hold in a different way. And I do often think about that as reclaiming. Memoir is so often about releasing shame or just helping yourself make sense of something that you don't or didn't understand. Dani Shapiro writes about this concept of the unthought known in her book, Inheritance. And I think so many memoirists can relate to that too, that there are these things that you've known, but you haven't really fully understood until you start to unpack them in your memoir. And all of that is so empowering and healing and energizing because it allows us to be the drivers of our own narrative and our own life story. And for some people, that takes a whole lifetime. But I do think that this is one of the many reasons that memoir is so compelling and why people toil away at them. And oftentimes, too, why once you decide that you are going to write one or want to write one, that they just don't let you go.
I love your definition of reclaiming being part of what memoir is all about. I think that should be part of a dictionary definition. So that's a great framing for it. And I definitely learned a lot from talking with Amanda in particular. She talked about how one definition of trauma is being trapped in another person's story of yourself. So I've been thinking about the nature of being trapped in another story ever since, really. And none of us will obviously ever endure the public damnation and the loss of self and story that Amanda did. But we definitely all face other stories about us and stories that can feel equally as damning and unfair, I think. So it is one of the primary reasons to write memoir, as you said, to claim and reclaim your story. And just to give you listeners a little background, if they weren't around here the first time, Amanda, she essentially undams herself through telling her story. She's written 2 memoirs now. The first one was Waiting to be Heard, a memoir. And then this one is Free, My Search for Meaning, which is largely about finding freedom within. And I just was so touched by how wise and balanced she was, and her book glows with insight and equipoise in my mind. And she somehow manages to tell the story of her wrongful conviction and the whole fallout from everything she's gone through without casting blame or without putting herself in the role of victim, which must be really difficult. I think it's a thin line to walk to balance the telling of her story to address skeptics and naysayers and trolls, without too much defensiveness. But, she presents the book as like a genuine search for her truth and a reclaiming of that truth and the nature of being trapped in another stories. So, I know we've all experienced this on some level.
Yeah, I think that's right. We do for sure write to feel seen and understood by ourselves, if not others, or by ourselves and others. And in her most recent book, Reading the Waves, Lidia goes back to the pains that she's carried in her body for years, and then she re-stories them. I love that word, re-stories. How do any of us lay down the stories of our past selves and what we have carried for far too long, she asks. So we've made up the stories of our lives, we've lived these lives, we make up the stories of these lives, and then you come to memoir and you're just trying to unpack all of that stuff, and things have happened to us, but we've also happened to things, and memories are conjurings. That's another thing that Lidia says, which means that they can be reconjured. And I like that so much. Lidia has a beautiful way of putting things into words, and I always love to listen to her, and I know you do too.
Absolutely. There's always a surprise in her language or a new kind of lens on it based on the words that she chooses. And, I think the more I learn about the ways we perceive the world and make memories and construct the stories of our lives, the more kind of unstable or unreliable I think everything is. We're definitely our stories. And sometimes those stories are the stories that are told to us or about us, but then when we tell the story ourselves, I think we might recreate it, but we can recreate it with a different point of view. So let's listen to Lidia and Amanda and ponder storytelling and reclaiming and shape-shifting right after this short break.
We're so excited to have Amanda Knox with us today. Amanda is an author, journalist, and podcast host whose work explores criminal justice, media ethics, and the human experience. She is the author of 2 memoirs, Waiting to be Heard and Free, My Search for Meaning, and co-hosts the podcast Labyrinths. Her writing and public speaking focus on wrongful convictions, storytelling, and personal transformation. Welcome, Amanda. We're really so excited to have you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So Free is your second memoir, and I'm curious to know what felt different for you about writing Free as opposed to writing Waiting to be Heard, and what did you bring to Free in light of that first experience you had of your first memoir?
Yeah, well, everything is different, if anything. And I write about writing my first memoir in my second memoir, so just to get super meta. But yeah, so my impulse to write my first memoir came from a very different place, right? Like I'd just gotten out of prison after 4 years. I had been living this nightmare where a version of me lived in the public's imagination that I had no authorship over. I really just went from being an anonymous person to being put into prison. And then all this huge, crazy story was put out there about me. And I felt like I had no say and no control over it. And so when I came home, I felt a sense of urgency to set the record straight, to at least put my one voice out there in that chorus of voices, and also do whatever I could to pay back my family. So that was the catalyst of that book. And I'm proud of it. I think it accomplished what it was set out to do. But looking back on it, as it compares to Free, My Search for Meaning, I look at them as two completely different stories, because one is the story of a bad thing that happened to me that was the result of other people's actions. So, a man named Rudy Gaudet broke into my house, raped and murdered my roommate, and then the police, and namely this prosecutor, Giuliano Mignini, pursued a case against me in a court of law. I had really not any say over any of that. So it didn't really feel like my story. It was a story of something bad that happened to me. Once I got out of prison and really when I was no longer on trial, that I was suddenly faced with this question of, now what? And so what? I went through this bad experience. So what? What does that mean to me? What does that say about who I am, or how I can move forward in my life? Am I trapped by this story that has been written about me? Am I trapped by this victimization that I survived, or that I'm still sort of living through, surviving because it is ongoing? Or can I find a way to sort of step out of this little box that I was put into and become my full person and really define who I am on my own terms? Because when I came home, I was still the girl accused of murder. Even if I was found innocent and I was vindicated and freed, I was not free from this accusation. I carried the stigma of this horrible experience in my life. And I realized pretty quickly that there was probably little to nothing that I would ever accomplish in my life that I would actually do that could define me more than this crazy experience and this crazy accusation that I had been put through as a 20-year-old. So wrapping my head around that and then figuring out how to act in my own life and what mistakes I made along the way was really what I felt like was the beginning of my story. And that is what I wrote about in Free.
Yeah, Amanda, that's so interesting. The perfect segue to my question, because before you came on, Brooke and I were talking about the topic of reclaiming and how memoir is a vehicle for reclaiming. And you definitely reclaim your story in Free, but it's also such a difficult line you have to walk. And you write in this book about a speech you give in Italy, which happened the first time you returned there after your wrongful conviction, and the exact tone you wanted to strike. And it seems to us that you had to strike that same just right tone with this entire book. And so I'm curious, how did you approach this? And did you ever just write out all of your anger and resentment along the way, stuff that ultimately didn't make the cut?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because you're right. I think there is a lot of pressure on wrongly convicted people, but especially women as well, to be graceful, right? To to carry whatever traumas you've had in your life with dignity. And so a part of me pushed back on that, and I call them my OnlyFans chapters of the book, where I try to talk about the nitty gritty, intimate part of just being a human being in this world, and, things like how I got back in touch with my sexual self in prison, despite the fact that I was being overwhelmingly vilified through my sexuality while I was on trial. And to go back to your note about reclaiming one's narrative, I think I was put through a very interesting experience. Now that I just that your question triggered this idea for me that I hadn't actually considered up until this point in this exact way. So kudos to you. But my life has always been, ever since, I was 20 years old, cast within the confines, within the frame of a story, right? Like that was what was being, investigated and represented in court. What was being represented in the media was a story. And I don't know how many people realize that aspect of our existence, which is this sense of narrative, that we are the protagonist of our own lives. I'm curious to know if that naturally develops in our 20s for everybody, or if it's simply like that developed for me early potentially because I was faced with these very specific stories that were being told about me that I had to push back against and prove that were not true. So maybe that's a question to sort of put a pin on to pitch back to you, because I'm actually now really curious about that.
Yeah. Now I want you to write another memoir based on that one.
Yeah, like do we? I know that like narrative, like there's this idea of narrative foreclosure when you talk about like trauma, right? Like trauma is in one sense like this idea that you do not have control over your own story. And that's why trauma is so traumatic. It's not just that you've gone through something horrible. It's that something horrible happened that pulled the rug out from underneath you, and you were like going along being the protagonist of your own story, and then suddenly someone completely rewrote the script, and you find yourself a pawn in someone else's story, or a villain in someone else's story, a victim in someone else's story. And that sense of narrative foreclosure, that you are no longer the author of your own experience, comes into play. And I'm curious if that is something that only comes to mind once you've realized, like once that sort of script is taken away from you, and if we all just sort of go along with our lives, not realizing that we're telling a story in our heads about who we are and what our story is, until we've had that story sort of taken away from us. So that's open question. But to go back to your question, which hopefully I have not forgotten, what was it again?
I also think it's perfect, Amanda. I mean, because our audience are memoirists and aspiring memoirists, and what you're talking about just resonates so much for me, because one of the things I couldn't stop thinking about when I was reading your book was the parallels to a lot of abuse memoirs that I work on.
Totally.
And so yours is very different, of course. I mean, you were wrongfully imprisoned, but it's the trauma that you just touched upon, and so it's curious to me, this drive that victims and survivors have to write their memoirs, which was kind of points back to Grant's original question. And like in this, I thought about the same way you had to go back to Italy, and a lot of people will say, I had to write this memoir. And so I'd love to know that from you, just about that drive. You said the first memoir was more about paying back your family and setting the record straight. This one just captures so much huger and important topics and universal topics as well. And, I'm curious the extent to which that felt as necessary, as going back to Italy.
Yeah, great question. And thank you for bringing me back to how I was attempting to answer your previous question. But you're right. Like this memoir, Free, is coming from a very different place. And I didn't realize that I had this memoir in me until I arrived at the point in the narrative, which is confronting my prosecutor. So for those who are curious, like I talk in this memoir about, how I survived prison, the mistakes and misadventures that I had when I returned to freedom, in quotes, where I'm free physically, but technically not free, both legally and just like psychologically, emotionally, feeling very ostracized by society, feeling like I was defined by this horrible thing that I had nothing to do with and didn't really know how I could exist in the world or do anything meaningful or purposeful. And then realizing that I felt this internal drive to understand my prosecutor, understand why he had put me through. So like in the victim's narrative, like, why did this person hurt me? Does he care that he hurt me? Like, would he ever apologize or acknowledge that he hurt me? That sort of thing just ringing in my head and haunting me and driving me to have a relationship with this person and to live out certain values and principles that had grown upon me, especially having survived a prison environment, which is this idea that in the wake of harm, instead of being punitive towards people, we should try to use restorative justice. So this idea of really, instead of punishing the perpetrator so much, we should empower the victim and try to bring the victim back to a place of being whole again, and not just assuming that punishing the perpetrator is going to do that. And that's a whole, complicated thing that I can get into. But I talk about it a little bit in the book about like finding myself immersed in this space of women who had committed crimes, but also had been victims of crime before they ever committed crimes in the first place. So it sort of complicated this whole question of punishment for me. But then, of course, I arrive at finally sitting down across from my prosecutor, and having the conversation that we had. And the feeling that I had coming out of it was, oh my God, I finally did something that defines me more than this terrible story that was written about me, this terrible thing that I went through. Like, I felt that I had finally did what I felt was the impossible, which was define who I was on my own terms in light of this story. And as soon as I walked out of that meeting, I was like, oh my God, I have a story to tell. Like, I wasn't just floundering about trying to make sense of this horrible thing that had happened to me anymore. I was not sort of reaching out for external validation anymore. I was like deeply, deeply settled and at peace and confident in my place in the world and my purpose. And that felt like a story arc. And I was like, this is my story. And so I had to then go back to write this story to where, like, getting lost. And over the course of this, narrative that spans, God, nearly 20 years, finding myself again and sort of being not limited by the experience that I went through, but informed by it, and finding the universal qualities to that story as well. Because one of the things that was so hard for me coming home from this and being so publicly vilified was that I didn't really feel like I belonged to the rest of humanity anymore. I didn't feel like I could be a normal person and have normal relationships. And I felt very, very alone. And one of my biggest goals is building bridges again and making connections again and feeling like I belong to the rest of humanity again. And in the process, realizing that by being very open about that journey for myself, I'm actually helping my people who read my story feel seen themselves, because they are going through versions of that in their own life. I mean, like, one of the craziest bits of feedback that has really made me feel like this was a successful memoir was when I translated the entire thing into Italian so that my prosecutor could read it before it got published. And he read it and he said, well, of course I disagree with a lot of your, perspective about the case, whatever, but I have never felt more seen. And I was like, what? Okay. All right. You know what? There is a universal quality of this story such that my own prosecutor felt seen in reading it.
Just listening to you now, I'm thinking, I mean, you obviously had such a horribly unique experience, right? And in closing, but I'm thinking it sort of magnified life in a way, like I'm thinking everything you experienced holds a commonality to the way we deal with people, especially even that distinction between understanding and forgiveness. I think we all want to be understood. And I think that is part of the purpose and meaning of memoir, is that we read stories that we will not have, but we will somehow relate to.
Yeah.
Is there anything in parting, that it just seems like you have evolved so much through this, it's horrible to say, like, you're a better person now, because who wants to go through that to become a better person? But, I just keep thinking of different relationships I have in my life while you were talking and being like, yes, make them feel understood, or vice versa.
Yeah.
So that's not really a question, but I'm just going to lob it out there.
Yeah, just like thoughts about memoir, I guess. I mean, your audience is interested in memoir. And I mean, it's a very powerful thing to take ownership of your own story. It's a little bit overwhelming because our lives are complex and complicated and moving in multiple different directions at any time. And so it's sometimes hard to see the memoir within the overall narrative of our lives. And I think that, I guess maybe if I were to offer one piece of advice to anyone who's thinking about writing memoir, is to write about what hurts, to write about what haunts you, because it is there that you have the opportunity to discover something about yourself and about the world. And so I have been given ample things to feel hurt and haunted by. And so I've had ample opportunity to discover myself and discover the world. And so just try to see the opportunity in that and then write.
Beautiful words to end on for our audience as well.
Right.
Yes, there it is. There it is. Thank you, Amanda, so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Brooke, I don't know if you noticed, but we launched an entire new organization dedicated to helping people write their memoirs.
Oh, is that what we've been doing these past months? Yes, I have to say, Grant, at the risk of self-congratulation, we have put together a really great offering, which will truly help people activate writing in their life in all ways, especially storytelling, personal narrative, memoir. And we're doing that by creating this hub and community of writers for writers. And then we're providing the inspiration, guidance, structure, and support to equip writers with all that they need to do to finish their story and just be engaged in their story, and not to mention this thing we care about so much, community.
Well, Brooke, like you, at the risk of self-congratulation, I love that intro, by the way, because I'm going to self-congratulate myself or us. And I actually don't think there's another memoir writing org quite like us. You know, I hear so many people say I'm going to write my story someday, but then, as we all know, those things that we say are going to happen someday, they tend to just always be off in the distance. They never quite arrive. And we want Memoir Nation to help people start writing their story today. So we're going to host this annual event each year in January, which we're calling Jan Your Story. And Jan Your Story is a challenge to write 500 words per day in 1 month, to start your memoir and build momentum to finish your story by year's end. And then we're providing, different levels of membership services ranging from free to $99 to $299 to $2,500 if you want to buy a lifetime membership for yourself or a family member.
Yeah. And Grant, I want to focus on the $299 membership because I think that is definitely our best bargain. You get our downloadable Crafting Your Memoir PDF. You get access to a library of resources and prompts, our weekly newsletter, I have to say, at the risk of self-congratulation. that is pretty good content. We're writing a lot of great stuff about memoir and just inspiration. Premium podcast content, all of our monthly classes, plus the recordings, and then our accountability session and quarterly mixers. The first one's going to be coming up this fall. So this online community stuff that we're working on to fuel your creative spirit is going to be kicking into full gear here in September. So I just want to say again, come join us. Start at free and see if you like it, and then you can always join at a paid level later.
Yeah, Brooke, thank you. And I can't wait for Jan Your Story. And at the risk of more self-congratulation, I think that Jan Your Story is just a really charming name for a writing event,
You did think of it, yes.
At the risk of congratulating myself, nobody else. Because I think what we want is to be a place of serious learning, but also lighthearted and fun, and a place where people can also find other like-minded people and community. So it's not going to be overly serious, even though there will be overly serious topics written about. We'll have a lot of serious discussions. But on that note, we've got a lot going on every week. But I hope people are going to gear up to kick off their memoir or regroup on their memoir or refuel their memoir in January. So we're going to start providing special content to get ready to write in January, starting in October.
Yeah, I'm excited about that. I think Jan Your Story is going to be a super amount of fun. Can't wait for it. And just generally at Memoir Nation, there is a lot going on. So this is the end of our ad for memoirnation.com. Thanks everybody for being a citizen. Go check it out. Happy summer.
I'm super excited to welcome back Lidia Yuknavitch to Write-minded. Lidia originally appeared on the show in 2020. Lidia is the national best-selling author of 4 novels, Thrust, The Book of Joan, Adora, A Head Case, and The Small Backs of Children, which was the winner of the 2016 Oregon Book Award's Ken Kesey Award for Fiction. The Misfits Manifesto is based on her popular 2016 TED Talk, The Beauty of Being a Misfit, and that was published by TED Books. Verge, a collection of short fiction, was released in 2020, and her widely acclaimed memoir, The Chronology of Water, was a finalist for a Penn Center USA Award for Creative Nonfiction. And her newest memoir, Reading the Waves, which we're going to talk about today, was just published by Riverhead Books. Welcome, Lidia.
My complete pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful.
Super excited to talk about your memoir, which I loved. And Lidia, Brooke and I have been delving into the nature of memory and retelling stories and all the ways we shift shapes as a result. That's your word. So I'd love to start there. You write, I believe our bodies are carriers of experience. I mean to ask if there is a way to read my own past differently, using what I have learned from literature, how stories repeat and reverberate and release us from the tyranny of our mistakes, our traumas, and our confusions. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about how this approach informs reading the waves, essentially how you read the waves of your life, in short.
Well, the idea of those sentences comes from my profound love of literature and art. And a thing that's so beautiful to me about reading literature is that when I reread something that I love, it's different every time. And I don't think that's just me talking. I think that's other people too. And the books and the pages don't change, which must mean I do. So I'm a different person and I'm bringing something different to the story, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was meditating on that very deeply and thinking about my own past and memoir writing and memory. And I thought, well, why don't we have another look at our own story experiences and how we've been telling them our whole lives? Why do we hold on to them so tightly? Like, what's at stake? And especially the stories that are hard for us, that we're carrying around of things that have happened to us, is there may be a way to do what I do when I come differently to literature, to stand in a different place or a different vantage point or ask different questions. And I think the answer turns out to be yes. And it's not like I'm a wizard. I know this isn't, gigantic, profound news, but it was a new experience for me to really engage with that question and literally go stand somewhere else.
Well, part of the shape shifting in your story is changing point of view, writing in the third person instead of first person. And so when talking about your ex-husband, Devin, you said it helps to write about us in third person, that slight distance that didn't happen. How did that shift from first person to third help change the shape of your story about Devin?
Well, when you're reading a novel or a poem and you imagine different characters and you're kind of invested in the characters, so they're sort of you, but they're not exactly you because, I'm not actually whoever that character is. But you imagine this kind of standing in their clothes and their shoes and doing what they do. And it releases you from the stuff you already know about yourself that's very limiting. Like, I already know all my flaws.
You think?
Most of them.
Most of them, yeah.
Most of them.
I still have some that are appearing.
Okay, I take that back. I mean, more are coming, I'm sure. But, they tend to limit our vision and our ways of experiencing things. But if we shift point of view and I'm suddenly an owl or I'm a horse, I see things differently. I smell things differently. I come to different conclusions. I behave differently. Different things harm me. Different things give me hope. And so if I allow myself to explore story space and characters and shape-shifting like I do in fairy tales or fables or literature, lo and behold, it opens up different, attitudes and aspects. And I keep coming back to this idea that you can bring better questions than why does this hurt or why do I suck? Like, you don't get very far with why do I suck?
Yeah, that's not necessarily a big opening question, I guess. That's a good segue, actually. I was recently listening to Monica Lewinsky's story in her interview on her podcast, Reclaiming. And it's fascinating to hear her talk now about her present self compared to the 24-year-old self, that was at the center of a global scandal. It's really fascinating. And one thing that stands out, of course, is how our life story changes and then changes again with time. just as you said, and we never create the one true story in our life, in other words. And you ask, I'm going to quote from your book, what if we could read our own past, our memories, even our bodies, as if they too were books open to endless interpretations? And you just said that essentially earlier, but I wondered about the notion of this endless interpretation. And as a writer and a person, I love viewing life like this because it just opens me up to the world and myself. But I also kind of wondered if it could be destabilizing, but then maybe destabilizing is good because maybe that's life.
Yeah. Wow. Those are really great questions and ideas. The destabilization, yeah, it's tricky for sure. I met Monica Lewinsky once, the same TED Talk series I was in. She was there and she wouldn't remember me. And I walked up to her, like, with my finger up my nose. Hi, I'm Lidia. I'm a writer. She's like, that's nice. Go away, blonde lady. But, we have this idea we work with at Corporeal Writing a lot. We even have a t-shirt that says this, which is, I'm not the story you made of me.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that's such a fluid idea and story space is that people project their stories onto us quite a bit in life. Or if you tell a story about yourself, people hold on to it really tightly, like that's the only thing you can ever tell. And she's a great example of that, like how you can be trapped or kind of burdened or held down by a certain kind of story. And so, yeah, there's still a danger that can lead to a destabilization if you start rearranging story elements or moving the story around. But I do believe it's, as you said, that we are dissolving and reconstituting all the time, physically, mentally, and emotionally. And the word for that is change. And change is life.
Mm-hmm.
And stasis is kind of nothingness. And so it can be painful, but, we're sloughing off skin cells every moment and hair, and we're dying and living and dying and living every moment we're alive. And so that's the expanded, beautiful way to think about it, even though sometimes it's also really scary.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is such an interesting conversation, Lidia, so much about the nature of memory being called into question. You write memories are conjurings, and I really love that. And memories aren't just events that happen to us. We make them, they make us, we make them again. And then there is a degree of choosing the story of our lives, especially for writers, and I think a lot of people are conscious of that, especially when they start working on their memoirs. You quote Jeanette Winterson, who wrote, "If you continually write and read yourself as fiction, you can change what's crushing you." And so I wanted to ask you about that. Did you make choices like this? And I imagine you did. And did writing this book change your life?
100%. Everything I've ever written changes my life a little bit. I think my DNA gets rearranged. You can see why I was attracted to that Winterson quote,
Mm-hmm.
Because we were just talking about that the volume on shape-shifting is turned up when you think about what she's saying. The same with Virginia Woolf, that you can rearrange pieces of your life in a different arrangement than whatever, quote unquote, happened to you. Those ideas are profound to me because locking in on one version of what happened kind of makes you into this 2D stuck image of yourself. And whatever happens to us happens. I'm not suggesting we change that. We're marked by the things that have happened to us. I'm suggesting we are ever able to move around in a 360 and be in relationship to what happened to us differently. And that's why her quote is so meaningful to me, because I agree. And as we were talking earlier, story space, the space of fiction. And for me, fairy tale and fable in particular allows for transmography. And I mean that both in terms of like what happens to frogs and butterflies, but I also mean it in terms of in what ways are we growing a new wing or a new tail to move through our own lives differently, instead of I'm going to have this broken heart my whole life and it's going to be the same broken heart my whole life and that's just it. That's all there is.
It always feels that way with a broken heart.
It does.
I've got to say.
I'm right with you.
Well, you mentioned, how moving around in a 360-degree, circle changes all the things it touches, I guess. And I was thinking, per a quote that you mentioned in your book, what people do to one story can affect all stories, And you write about an early experience where your mother catches you engaged in sexual activities with a girl and then ends that relationship. And you write, my mother's early erasure of my erotic experience with a girl hides underneath every story. So I was very curious about that, about how that hides under every story and what that means.
Yeah, I was trying to kind of shine a flashlight on a becoming moment. Like I was right on some kind of threshold, maybe, of becoming one thing. And the shame, the shaming incident, which so many of us go through in our lives, but also my mother and I never could quite perfectly love each other. So it was not just shame, but some kind of, I wanted to love my mother so much, and that deepened the cavern between us in a way that I just, it wounded me for life. And so a whole lot is in that scene. And I'm far enough away from it now to go back and look at it and maybe retrieve some of the soul and some of the, beauty and some of the desire and some of the love. And I think those retrievals, I know we all know what soul retrieval is. And I'm not exactly talking about that because I think in terms of narrative and stories, but it's certainly kindred with other disciplines' ideas about soul retrievals. I think it's good to go back and get the pieces of yourself that didn't die and could maybe be rearranged in your present tense.
It's beautiful, and that's quite an invitation to some of our personal writers and memoirists out there, I think. There's another episode where you write about a boyfriend you call the poet. He's abusive. He nearly kills you in his boat. And then when a towboat rescues you, you choose not to get in it, but to swim alongside it to shore. And then when you arrive on the shore, you encounter a bunch of cheering guys. And then you have to go home with the poet. And you write, what would it take for the story to undergo a release, an adaptation, so that a woman emerging triumphantly from water might carry the heart of the matter instead of the fucked up fist of things that came? Why can't I be the swimmer? Why can't a woman be the epic novel of herself? Then you do write that version here in this book. So could you speak more to that transformation?
Yeah, when I was in process writing that part over and over again, draft after draft, trying to figure out what the hell I was trying to say, it deeply occurred to me that my novels do that. In my novels, there's always some brave, courageous young girl who's I write her as glorious and triumphant and Valkyrie-like over and over again. And so that's where she lives, I guess, for me. And there was this other interview I was in with OPB with Dave Miller, and he teared up and he goes, "Don't you see that was you?" And I felt compassion for him because he was tearing up. And I get it that, yeah, I did that. But the sort of stepping into the glory of a self just hasn't been my life. But I can step into the conjuring of a story. And I think that might be more useful to other people anyway.
Well, I have a couple questions that focus on words that I've noticed that you use a lot, and so I'm curious if you're conscious of them. They actually mean a lot to me. And the first one is I don't know if you remember this, but you actually very generously blurbed my book, All the Comforts Sin Can Provide.
Of course I do.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. That blurb meant so much to me and means so much to me. And you used the word slippage in the blurb, and it was the first time I'd kind of really heard that word or thought about it. You know, it was a slippage of behavior or a slippage of morals. And I thought that was exactly what it is sometimes, just like a slippage, not a bad or conscious intention necessarily, but a part of life, you know, almost like dropping something.
Yeah.
And I noticed you use the word somewhat frequently in this book. So I just wanted to know more about what the word slippage means to you existentially.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Yeah, I get really attached to individual words. And I love the idea that they could change meaning hundreds of times. That's why I return to them. It's not to redundant manner, it's reshaping. But slippages in particular, I neither believe anyone is as heroic as we want to pretend they are, nor as, you know, our mistakes aren't as horrific as we tend to believe they are, even when they're terrible. And the word slippage, like you said, carries with it this idea that it was a fraction. It was a moment. It was, you know, everything was going one way, and then a small turn happened, or like that scene with my mother, or how the boat in the lake did not hit me in the skull. Or, you know, like the way a story was almost a success story, but then it became a story of something else. Those small motions, and I have been influenced by Virginia Woolf in this way mightily. It's those micro moments, those micro instances where our deeds take on volume or erasure. And so slippages kind of reminds me of that. Also, I'm not physically graceful.
Despite being a great swimmer?
Yeah, if you dip me in water, I become as agile as a seal. But in regular life, I'm the person with 100 bruises, and I'm going to hit my knee on the desk when I get up, and I'm going to bang my shoulder on the doorway when I'm on land, I'm bumbly. So, you know, slippages allows for a description of my experience on land that corresponds to my reality.
I love the word. So I'll try to attribute you every time I say it, because I feel like it's your word. And same with this next word. You used this in our interview in 2020, the word intensities. And it meant a lot to me, actually, when I teach plot, and I don't teach plot. I mean, that's one thing that came up in our talk was that we'd each read Natalie Sereau, and that had kind of changed our notions of plot into these micro moments, as you mentioned.
Totally.
And so you write now, you say people are sometimes too interested in what happened, the plod of plot and action. Sometimes the rest of the story, or perhaps the heart of the story, is carried by image, repetition, tiny intensities not captured fully from plot and action. So in closing, can you tell us more about how you write with intensities?
Yes, I love this idea, as you already know, because we've sort of gotten excited about it in the past. I think we've been trained to go straight to large dramas and actions. And more than half of my life, in fact, I think most of my life, has occurred in the periphery or slightly behind my head or in something tiny that's going on next to the big action. But the tiny thing, the object or the gesture or the sound or the color or the light or the smell, was carrying all the meaning in a series of micro moments. And the grand action or the grand drama is almost a mirage.
I'm with you. I love that. It's my religion, kind of.
Right with you. I bow.
Yeah. I love the inspiration too from the Virginia Woolf, because we're talking about that in our banter as well, you know, in the moments of being. And when you really think about that, if you can meditate in that moment, I think you can find so much scenic detail there in your writing.
Yeah, so agree. And we also get hung up on big, huge, dramatic actions in a way that keeps us from learning what the real lessons might be.
That's interesting to think about.
Thank you, Lidia. It's great to see you again, and thanks for coming back.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, we're making it easy for ourselves here by doing the same closing for all 4 of these August episodes. So thanks for listening this time. And if you're a regular listener and it's mid-August, you can toggle off the show now. Just kidding. We thank you and we wish you a happy August, and we welcome you checking out Memoir Nation and our upcoming offerings. And between now and the end of the year, you're going to see some pretty transformational stuff going on. We're launching some new community features and we're getting prepared for some writing challenges. So if you haven't already signed up, check out the free level of memoirnation.com, and then at least you'll get updates about what's coming up, and we'll stay connected in your inbox and also here in your ears on the podcast. You all make Memoir Nation possible, so thank you, and until next week.